Greetings and welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we are joined by Mr. Marty Staples, CEO of Topaz Energy, a Calgary-based energy company listed on the TSX with a market cap of approximately $4 billion. Mr. Staples has over 20 years of experience in the energy industry in the areas of leadership, management, business development, exploration, land, and evaluations. Previously, Mr. Staples spent 10 years at Tourmaline Oil Corp, playing an integral role in the growth and development of the company, including the execution of approximately $3.7 billion in cumulative asset and corporate acquisitions. Mr. Staples holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree from the Haskins School of Business at the University of Calgary. Among other things, we discuss growing Topaz from inception to a market cap of approximately $4 billion, creating win-win deals, and how a pandemic IPO created opportunity for the company. This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. This podcast episode is brought to you by Canada Action. Canada Action strongly believes that as long as the world needs oil and natural gas, it should be supplied by Canada, where the economic benefits support our Canadian families and social programs. Canada Action believes it's time to champion our energy sector to help build Canada up and get our national economy back on track. Learn more at canadaaction.ca. This episode is brought to you by Upgrade Labs. Upgrade Labs offers a comprehensive range of cutting-edge performance and recovery services that have been proven to optimize your health in minutes, not hours. Whether it's accelerating muscle mass and bone density or addressing injury and inflammation, start your experience by booking a free cell health analysis at upgradelabs.com/Calgary. This podcast is brought to you by Energy United. Energy United is an organization with a mission to promote practical energy policy across Canada. Energy United is building a community of Canadians that are passionate about Canada's natural gas and oil industry and are willing to take action. Energy United is driving change on issues that matter, all the way from the carbon tax to the emissions cap. Join Energy United to make a difference at energyunited.ca. Okay. Good morning, Mr. Marty Staples. Thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
You bet, Trevor. It's great to be on the show. I know this is going to be your 200th episode, so congrats to your success on the podcast. I think it's fantastic. You started hassling me, I think, in April of 2020. I'd just taken the CEO role at Topaz, and I didn't think I had enough to talk about. So my head fake out of that was, hey, Trevor, I'll do your 200th episode, secretly thinking you'd never get there. Because a lot of people in the podcast world, I think, just kind of quit on this business, but you've stayed with it. And I tell you, the amount of guests that you've been able to attract to the podcast. I know I've been to New Brunswick, I've been to Ontario, all over Canada. And every single one of those people ask me about the podcast. I think because you've referenced my name and they ask if we get a royalty on it for every name that I've helped introduce you to on the show. So yeah, congrats to you, man.
Well, I just have to say thank you as well as one of the biggest supporters of the podcast. I really appreciate it. A lot of people they give advice, kind of watered down advice on stuff and podcast guests, but when Marty Staples gives a recommendation, not only is it a good one, people listen. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Really appreciate it. Although you don't have a royalty on the podcast yet.
The second question I get is this Trevor Rose related to Mike Rose? And for the audience, he's absolutely not related to Mike Rose, and so completely independent. No affiliation there.
I don't think you thought I'd get to 200, like you said.
No, I've seen or heard a lot of different podcasts where you kind of see a general interest, and I think just like any good sitcom or any series, the first two seasons go really well, and then people run out of material. But I think kudos to you. You've continued to add guests, and you've had guests that people want to listen to. We talked about, and I won't make you share it again, some of your favorite podcast guests, and one of the comments I can make is you can tell right away who some of the great guests are that you've had, and they've all been good. Just some are really good and been fantastic. I think Jason Kenney was one of my favorites for sure. I went to Notre Dame in Saskatchewan. He's an old Notre Dame hound, and to see some alumni on the show is pretty cool for me to see as well.
Well, maybe we'll get into a little bit about you, but to start off for the listener, you are the CEO of Topaz Energy. But what is Topaz Energy?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, 2019, I was at Tourmaline for almost 11 years. And in 2019, we thought, look, there's a generational opportunity to acquire what we saw as assets that had never really been available in that capacity before. And Mike sat a bunch of us down and said, hey, I want to create a spinoff company to help finance that. And it's going to be a royalty/infrastructure business. And when I say royalties, that's where, just to give everybody a listener an idea of what a royalty is we take a stream off the wellhead, and it's on the natural gas, the NGLs from time to time, the condensate, the oil, the liquids. On average, it's about a 4% gross overriding royalty across our portfolio. Our main partner being Tourmaline. We have other public parties that are invested with us, or that we have invested in, being Whitecap, Tamarack Valley, Headwater, Advantage, New Vista, and Strathcona. The idea of it, though, when you think about the narrative that was happening in 2019, there was a real movement of equity leaving the space, not just Canadian public equity, but and a lot of the pension funds, but the private equity was leaving as well. And I think that's where Mike's head was at, was there was this opportunity to acquire assets that he really had wanted and maybe didn't want to pay the price, but they're trading at a very deep discount. Part of that was because of an ESG movement that was taking place. I think government in Canada wasn't being as supportive as we would hope to fund and grow the oil and gas industry. And we created Topaz really to finance that vehicle. And that's exactly what it did. And so our first acquisition was a small company called Polar Star in Northeast BC. We moved on to Chinook right after that. Topaz was created and I guess announced in October of 2019, and by November of 2019 the deal had closed. And so the original spinout was an $800 million transaction. Tourmaline owned 74% of it. Some very well-known, I would say, public entities would have owned the other 26%. And it got started, and we went to work and decided that this would just sit as kind of its own entity. Well, Topaz got pretty big pretty quick, and we realized that we couldn't just run it under a management services agreement in Tourmaline. And in April of 2020, Therese Stevenson and myself both joined Topaz full time. And think about that environment. Let's talk about a second kind of wind that was coming into us. And we had oil prices going to negative, and COVID shut the world down. And I remember looking at Therese Stevenson and saying, my God, what did we just sign up for? I just left Tourmaline to go and run this Topaz company. I'm sorry for bringing you over. In fact, it ended up being the best time ever, I think. Oil prices were at a very depressed value. Equity was not in the system in any capacity, and debt was becoming a four-letter word. We saw interest rates continue to rise, and that was part of the strategy of Topaz. We didn't want to go and issue equity at a discount and at Tourmaline, and didn't want to take on a bunch of debt. And so Topaz did exactly that. We started getting calls from other partners. Advantage was the first one, and said, hey, that thing you're doing with Tourmaline, can we manage some of that? And good for Mike Belinkie over there, a guest that you've had on the phone on the pod, I think a couple times now. We were able to transact on his Glacier plant. We bought a 12.5% working interest under a 15-year take-or-pay arrangement. And so that became the next piece of our infrastructure business. In October of 2020, we IPO'd the company. I think of all the IPOs in Canada that happened in 2020, there wasn't many. We were the only energy company that IPO'd that year. And so you talk about stress and jumping into the water with two rocks in your hands. That was one of the most exciting and anxious times of my life, for sure. But we got it done and off to the races now 4 years later.
Maybe we'll get into the story behind the IPO, but to go back to the beginning, how'd you get into energy and why? If I'm correct, you're from Saskatchewan originally?
Yeah, that's correct. I grew up in a small town called Kindersley, Saskatchewan. I think 50% of the town is farmers. The other 50% work in the oil field. And 100% of those people are all entrepreneurs. Very entrepreneurial town. I remember I had a baseball coach who was a waterbed salesman and ultimately became one of the biggest rental suppliers and hot oil truckers in Kindersley. It was just available. And when you saw people that have such a drive and such a pride in what they do. And that translates to my whole family. My grandfather fought in World War II. His brother fought alongside him. They came back from the war and started a clothing business called Staples Menswear. And that's something my dad and my uncle took over later on. And so always kind of saw that being your own business type mentality around my family. And it translated through that whole town. Everybody was just tremendously proud of what they did. And Kinnersley continues to be an oil town that and a farm town that just has a lot of great people that are from there. Very proud to be from Kinnersley, Saskatchewan. I think it's one of the greatest towns a kid could grow up in. That translates very well, I think, into people in Alberta. And I think that's why Alberta and Saskatchewan people get along so well. Left Kinnersley when I was 15 to go to school at Notre Dame. I mentioned that before, and played some hockey there. Really got to understand what it was to be on a team and live with people. We had a dorm of 4 boys per room, and I think there was 90 people per dorm. And so you were really living with peers of your own age group and trying to grow up quick. And that's what kind of led me to, I think, eventually the oil patch is I wasn't a good enough athlete to continue on in sport. And so I remember being in the hospital one time. I had an injury in hockey, and after the 3rd week of being in the hospital, I said I better go to university. So I ended up starting in geology of all things, and thought I was going to be a great geologist until I sat around and figured out how smart and dedicated geologists really are. Transferred over to the business side and went to Haskeen School of Business. I was getting my resume critiqued. I remember just about ready to graduate, and a lady by the name of Ann Dyer started talking to me. And you'll find through this podcast, I probably don't quit talking very much. I go on a little bit of a rant from time to time. She went through my resume and said, "Hey, I think you need to be a landman." And I kind of stepped back and said, "Geez, any landman I've ever talked to came out and talked to my grandfather about trying to get a surface lease." And I said, "I don't know if that's exactly what I want to do." And she said, "No, there's this whole program at UFC that deals with minerals," and thought it would be perfect for me. And so ultimately I ended up getting into the land program and spent about a 20 to 22 year career in the land business before I transferred over into the role I have at Topaz now. And you know what they say, once a landman, always a landman. I will say, like, there's a great series coming out on Prime Plus called Landman. I think Billy Bob Thornton is starring in it. Just for the audience, it's not anything like that. I think they're over dramatizing it, just like any landman story. They build it up bigger than it is.
And then when did you join the Tourmaline crew? I think you started at Duvernay?
No, I wasn't at Duvernay. I was at a small company called Peloton. Peloton eventually sold to Sequence. That was at the end of 2009. I started talking to the Tourmaline folks and joined full-time in 2010. So when I joined Tourmaline, it was about 3,000 BOE per day. And when I left, it was around 330,000 BOE per day.
Do you remember your first day at Tourmaline?
Yeah. It was pretty interesting. I worked for one of the best guys in the world, great friend, real father figure to me, and always been a mentor, Drew Tumback. And I came in to start my first day. I had just had my second kid. And so I remember second daughter had just been born, and it was 2 weeks after that had happened, sat down, and Drew came in and said, "Here's a file, figure it out. I'm going on holidays for 2 weeks." So he's going to hate that I said that, but yep. Yeah, I remember that perfectly. And then Brenda Davidson, who was a pretty important person, contracts lady at Berkeley, Duvernay, and Tourmaline, and really I think was my end to get into Tourmaline. She had said to me, "Hey, all that file, I'm not helping you with any of it. Figure it out." So good for those people. It's back to here's 2 rocks and see if you can sink or swim.
Jumping in at the deep end.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. Circa 2020, the Topaz IPO. At the time, things weren't certain. What were you thinking? Did you think we have this amazing opportunity ahead of us? We need to really take advantage of this? Because during the pandemic, it wasn't guaranteed that the company was going to be a success. What were you thinking at the time?
Well, I remember the original plan was to IPO the company in June of 2020. And I'm glad we pushed that out, because in between then we were able to get the Advantage transaction done, as well as a private placement. And we ended up raising $145 million in June of 2020 for some acquisitions, one being the Advantage acquisition, and then a few going into IPO. It's good sometimes to not know what you don't know. I've never been inside the walls of doing an IPO, although I was at Tourmaline when it went from private to public. I was pretty junior then, and I wouldn't have been exposed to as much. And, thankfully I had a CFO in place that had been through a private to public IPO before, and so was very familiar with that. And I got to give a lot of credit to the Tourmaline folks too. I mean, Sarah Tate, Katie Beck, Scott Kirker, Brian Robinson, and of course Mike Rose. They've done this. They're professionals at this. And so to have kind of the advantage of access to them was fantastic. BDP was on our legal side. Peters led our deal. Scotia co-led. The bankers, the lawyers, the whole group. And that's how great Calgary is. The amount that industry comes together to do things like this. They all know what they're doing. And then finally, the support we had, and this is not first time support, but of existing shareholders that have been in Tourmaline, new shareholders that we'd sourced out to. It was a real odd time. I remember the road show, we did 88 one-on-ones. And normally on a road show, you would go to different cities and do it in person, but we were doing it all virtually. And Teams and Zoom hadn't really caught up to what we were doing yet. So I remember Jamie Hurd, who was at every single one of our, and you've had him on the show as well, was at every single one of our presentations. And Jamie would be running the slide deck, and Sri and I would be talking to a phone box because you couldn't really, in October of 2020, translate the two together yet. And so it was an amazing time. And I think at a boat call 44, Jamie, Sri, and myself all looked at each other and said, okay, what word are you saying that you got to quit saying because it's driving me nuts right now? And mine was, I think it was tippy top. And I don't know why I was saying that on calls, but it was absolutely ridiculous. So extremely stressful, but we got it done. We'd start on the East Coast and kind of go through like central Canada, central US, and then on the West Coast. And so it was kind of 5:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. at night. And then we'd stay at the office for another 5 to 6 hours getting the prospectus done because there was a bunch of information that had to go out. And at the time, full time at Topaz, it was just Sri and myself. And so, like I said, very thankful for the support we got from the Tourmaline folks.
To give credit where credit's due, whose idea was Topaz Energy?
Let's give full credit to Mike Rose on that. I think he had a 6-pack of Traditional, his favorite beer, and probably wrote it back on the back of a napkin and said, guys, this is what we're going to do. And this is why we're going to do it. And I remember even some doubters at the start thinking like, this isn't going to work. Like the timing doesn't seem right. But the conviction that Mike had in doing something like this was phenomenal. And he mapped it out all for us. And you got Mike Rose and Brian Robinson making some calls like that. They're right a lot of the time, almost all the time. And so, yeah, I think that's an easy answer.
It hasn't changed, but at the time during COVID 2020, what was the value prop for Topaz to investors who may have had skepticism about traditional energy at that time? What did you tell them?
We were a new management team, pretty well unknown. And so I think the just trust us mentality that energy is kind of put out to investors didn't exist anymore. And so we had to put actions into words. And I remember one of the questions we got asked on the IPO is, how are you going to compete in the Clearwater? And we didn't really have an answer for that other than just watch us. We had just done our first Clearwater with a private company called Cresswin in September of 2020 and led that into the IPO. We since then have done deals with Tamarack Valley. We did our first pretty much every deal they've done inside the Clearwater that they're growing right now. We are a partner in with them, and then bought a royalty off Cenovus that Headwater owns. And so we are the largest royalty producer inside the Clearwater right now, about 3,000 barrels a day of production. I think the real proposition was companies are trading at 2 to 3 times. Royalty infrastructure companies are trading at 12 to 13 times. There's an arb here that we can play right now where we can provide capital today to producers, and on the back end, they can use that capital to either grow their business through acquisitions, pay down some debt, or deploy it back into capital in the ground. And we'll take that risk. We'll underwrite that deal today. You don't have to go and raise equity. You don't have to go back to the banks and increase your RBL. Like I said, debt was becoming a 4-letter word. Interest rates were accelerating at a significant pace. And so from our standpoint, yeah, we thought that there was a good arb that companies could play and can continue to play. And I think that's why we've been so successful. We've done $2.6 billion in acquisitions. We still are very acquisitive. We've maintained a very, I would say, modest balance sheet. We just actually increased our debt to the highest it's ever been, and that's 1.5 times debt to EBITDA. So very conservative, have $500 million of credit capacity on the balance sheet. So yeah, we're going to continue to be acquisitive. But I mean, in the other regard, We're not going to do every single royalty deal. We're not going to do every single infrastructure deal. We typically look at about $2 billion in opportunities per year. This year, we've done $400 million in acquisitions.
In basic terms, for the layman investor, royalties are a great business model because the margins are very high. You don't have to take the drilling risk and you don't have the liabilities associated with a traditional wellbore in basic terms. I don't know if that's a good way to summarize it, but
yeah, the operating margin on a royalty is 90+% operating margin. We've tried to structure an infrastructure business very similar to that because we take these long dated take or pay contracts. And what that means, you take the contract, you get paid whether they use it or not, of anywhere from 10 to 15 years. Our operating margin in our infrastructure business is 80%. And so it's almost like having a royalty on infrastructure. And that's kind of how we look at both sides of our business. That translates into a 90+% free cash flow margin business. And that has allowed us to increase our dividend by 8 times. That's a 65% increase in our dividend since 2020, which is a big driver of our business. And we're going to pay a lot of that cash back. I think we creep up to almost $1 billion of cash paid back next year in dividend alone. And that's without any acceleration to what we've seen or expansion we've seen to the stock price.
this podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info@conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This episode is brought to you by the Canadian Gas Association. The Canadian Gas Association represents Canada's natural gas delivery industry, whose members include distribution companies, transmission companies, equipment manufacturers, and other service providers. The Canadian Gas Association members deliver safe, reliable, and affordable natural gas to meet 38% of Canada's energy needs. Visit cga.ca to learn more about Canada's natural gas. You're good at doing deals. How did you get good at doing deals? Is it working alongside senior leaders in the industry at Tourmaline?
I think I come by it naturally. I talked about
What makes a good deal to you?
Well, I talked about like growing up in Saskatchewan and seeing my grandfather, my uncle, my dad in a clothing store and always trying to do a sale. And I joke around when I was in university and I'd have a spare class, I'd go over to the ski shop and see if I could get a better deal on a pair of ski boots or a pair of skates or a pair of gloves. And to me, like I've just always been so deal orientated. Like even my 3 daughters, when they ask for something, I make them negotiate it for me. And so life's a negotiation, and it's just how hard you want to negotiate, I guess. But to me, what makes a good deal is where everybody feels good after and you want to come back and do another deal. And that's been evident, I think, in just this business alone. We've done 5 deals with Tamarack Valley. We've done 6 deals with Tourmaline. We've done 2 deals with Whitecap. We've done 2 deals with Headwater. I think when you get done a deal and everybody sits back and thinks about it and they're satisfied with how that deal went, that's to me what makes a good deal. And I don't know, I'm always thinking about how to improve the business, what parts of the basin I want to be in. It's just a very busy mind, I guess, for how I want to transact.
There are other royalty companies in the energy sector. So what makes Topaz different than your peers?
Yeah, I mean, there's some fantastic companies out there on the royalty business, and
They're all pretty good.
You said it early. They're great businesses, and I'll name them like Prairie Sky, fantastic business. About 50% of their 18.5 million acres is fee land, and so it's the perpetuity of having that acreage. They don't have to go out and develop it. In fact, when we bought a company called Keystone, we inherited 400,000 acres. Craig Lothian was the president. And I said, Craig, tell me your best story you've heard about why you inherited Keystone. A gentleman by the name of Michael Allen is the guy who started Keystone. And the reason he called it Keystone is he was from Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania and area. And so he used to have a company called Treasure Island. And Treasure Island was like the Walmart of the 1960s. Peter Allen was a geologist. He came out and did a bunch of seismic activity for Imperial, eventually moved into Southeast Saskatchewan and started buying people's mineral rights. And he would offer a silver dollar coin to farmers to try and take over their mineral rights is the story I heard. He would get these contracts advertised in the Regina Post, Saskatoon Star Phoenix, to try and acquire mineral rights. Michael Allen said he would, well, this is the story I heard, he would be at Treasure Island and he'd wait for somebody to call, and somebody call and say, hey, I want to lease this land. And he wouldn't answer the phone. He'd keep them on hold for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. And he said if he picked up the phone and they were still on the phone, that meant they really wanted to do a deal. If they hung up, they weren't that interested. And so from my side, I think that's a great story about the fee and just how you can hold it and wait for it and eventually negotiate to your own terms. The example we always use about a company like Prairie Sky is, yes, they've got dedicated capital going to it, but they're like an empty office tower and they're waiting for leasers to come in and lease apartment by apartment or office by office. We've tried to fill the 3 biggest floors we can with as much asset as we can. And so we want to be full all the time. I think we've been able to achieve parts of the basin and access parts of the basin that haven't been accessible before. That was important to us. And that was because of a 2020 downturn and because of a retreat of equity and an increase to debt. These have not been accessible. And Mike Rose commented on it. We had a generational opportunity to acquire assets that hadn't been accessible before. Freehold, another company, runs a great business. I think they're very similar to, I think, the way Prairie Sky operates. They do have a presence in the U.S. that they've stepped into. Canada is the place that we want to play for right now. I think Prairie Sky is similar to that. Heritage, a private company, they spun out of Cenovus, really focus on the Palliser Block and Pelican Lake, but running a great business, and that's 99% owned by private equity, and but great margins in that business as well. And then there's some smaller companies, Source Rock, Ruralco right now, that exist as well. And so, but it is a great business, and I think all these companies I mentioned are doing fantastic.
You added infrastructure to the business model. So I guess the question is, why did you do that?
Infrastructure was a component of the business since day one. We took 2 gas plants with Tourmaline when we did the formative deal, one in Musreau, one in Brazeau. We are now at 7 gas plants, 2 water facilities, and are just finalizing a gathering system. What I love about the infrastructure business is just the certainty of it. We make about 28% of our revenue right now from the infrastructure portion of our business. It's grown 85%, and I think people forget about how much our infrastructure business has grown. It's doing just about $90 million of our total revenue. When we started the business in 2020, our entire EBITDA was $89 million. And so we've actually kind of crossed that initial dollar value that we had. Why I think it's important, it's like a natural hedge on commodities. That infrastructure business, although it's 28% of our revenue, covers 50% of our dividend. Ultimately, I think we'd like to see that get to about 70% coverage on our dividend, but it's just the insulation of that business. We take newer facilities. All of them are less than 10 years old. We have some of the best operators in the basin, Tourmaline, Advantage, Tamarack Valley, Headwater, and then on the water side, New Vista and Strathcona. In fact, the water business was a real neat one for us. We took 2 deals, one with Strathcona, one with New Vista, and did long-term take-or-pay contracts of 15 years on water. And that's sourcing water, that's piping water, that's using it for fracs, and then re-injecting it into the ground. And so not only is it great from just a water management standpoint, but from an ESG standpoint, you got less trucks on the road, you're reducing GHA emissions, just a big win for us all around.
One of the best ways to win at the infrastructure game is to have the highest throughput possible in order to get ahead of things and go where the puck is going. Where do you see the biggest throughput for Topaz in the future? Is it up in the Montney in Northeast BC?
Yeah, so our kind of pillars of how we've thought about our strategy from an acquisition standpoint, it always starts with quality of the rock, quality of the asset, call it. And so for infrastructure, that's everything's less than 10 years old. It's newer facilities. It's tied to really good geology. We think the second kind of box that we like to check is the quality of the management team. Are they an experienced management team? Have they done this before? How are they allocating their capital? What does their balance sheet look like? Do they have any concerning tier 2 debt that exists on the business? And then finally, number 3 is how does that allocate back to us from an accretive cash flow standpoint? We want all our shareholders to make money and do well in the business. So I would say that we're pretty agnostic as to what part of the basin saying all that. We want to partner with really high quality operators and really high quality assets. And that's probably the bigger check boxes for us. Yeah, I think the Montney right now is one of the best plays, not just in Canada, but in North America. The amount of recoverable gas and associated liquids that are going to exist there and continue to expand it's just very early innings. If you're a baseball guy, I think we're at the first pitch, not even the first inning. So lots of running room there for us for sure.
If I'm correct, there are two ways to make a royalty. You can manufacture one by drilling a well or acquiring one that exists already. Do you have a preference for the Topaz business model?
Yeah, I think manufacturing the royalties has been our preference. Like I said, a lot of these crown acres that we've been able to access have never had a royalty on them before, or they're pretty clean. And some of the existing royalties that you'd be buying are on older, tired assets that would have been drilled up. There was two ways to do deals back in the day. You could purchase a section of land, or you could do a farm-in. And sometimes farm-ins came with royalties, and a lot of those royalties are anywhere from 10 to 15% gross overriding royalties in addition to crown. It becomes the last thing that an operator wants to do. And so what we've thought about is, how do we maintain a royalty that is small enough to entice that operator to keep drilling? And so that's why we've kind of targeted anywhere from 2 to 7% royalties versus the 10 to 15%, because I think any engineer, any geologist, any financial person is going to look at the economics of an unencumbered land or section versus encumbered land. And so if you make that encumbrance too big, it becomes kind of kryptonite for the operator. They don't want to touch it. Saying that, on the back end, what has allowed us to participate so aggressively, and Prairie Sky and Freehold in the Clearwater, is some of the royalty holiday that exists there. These things can take a burden just based on the calculation of royalty relief that you get inside the Clearwater.
Things are going well at Topaz. The share price is, if I'm correct, almost at an all-time high today, $28. So that's awesome. But how do you keep a reflective mindset at Topaz? In other words, it ain't over till it's over, to make sure you stay humble.
We're pretty excited. We've had good days and bad days at Topaz where, the stock price is definitely always a marker of how you're performing. But we're of the mindset sometimes you just got to turn off your ticker and get to work. I think we're always looking at something and finding ways to try to improve the business. We got a team of 13 people over here, and every single one of them is an entrepreneur. They're all looking at different parts of the business and how to improve it. We're pretty lucky to have the team we do around us. Everybody's driven. Everybody wants to win. It's kind of like back to being on a sports team. If you're in kind of a good team environment, everybody's driving the same direction. And so it's not time to stop. It's time to get more aggressive and try to build the business and put the best things you can in front of the business. If you use stock price as your only gauge, I think ultimately you're not going to win. And so if we build a good foundation and keep doing what we say we're going to do, I think ultimately the business is it's going to flourish.
Topaz has done some deals lately between fundraising and M&A. You stuck loyal to certain banks like Peters & Co., who, after all these years, still leading deals. So how important is it to you to lean on a company like that lives and breathes energy and is there for you?
Great question. We've had a relationship with, well, myself too, with Peters for the last 18 years. And I think it's important to have relationships with all the banks. And I talk to the banks about this all the time, is all this business is up for grabs. You need to work hard as I expect my staff to work, to ensure that you're in that seat. It doesn't come for free. I think they continue to perform. I think having somebody that's a pure energy player has been important. We've got two members on our board who, you've talked to both of them, Jim Davidson and Steve Lark. Mm-hmm. Steve is ex-Peters, Jim's ex-First Energy. They were the other boutique firm that I think it's extremely important. But we do have energy specialists. I think about some of the research guys that cover our story, some of the sales guys that cover our story, some of the investment bankers that cover our story. I think it's important to have relationships with all of them, and it's up to everybody to earn it, though.
Sometimes when companies are doing well, it's easy to get complacent. How does Topaz avoid complacency to keep the momentum going?
I think it's the fear of failure. Just because things are good doesn't mean you stop. I think there's a drive in every single person in this organization, from the chairman of the board to me. I mean, it's I think it's exciting to be part of a story that wants to win. And there just isn't complacency in, I think, anybody's genetics here.
Got to keep showing up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doing podcasts like this.
Yeah.
You love the energy sector. Some people, it's important to love the sector and the business versus loving compensation, so to speak. When did you realize you love the sector?
I'm going to say probably one of the first days I got into it. Good friend of mine, his dad ran a bunch of companies. His name's George Onyearth. We, in fact, at Tourmaline ended up buying Cinch Energy, which George Onyearth was one of the, I think he was the president at the time. But George's advice to me was, hey, just work hard, show up every day, and the compensation will find you. And so never really was that my concern was, and I remember my first job offer I got downtown Calgary was from Sequel Energy. Gary Peddle had called me in and he had an envelope in it and said, yeah, here's your job offer. And I said, what do you mean I'm in? And he said, no, you got to actually read the job offer, Marty, and sign it. And I said, well, what does that mean? Like, no, I'll take the job. So I went down to my truck and opened the envelope, signed it, and came back up and started, I think, the next week. But yeah, it's such an exciting industry. There's no other industry like it. You think about the crossover of finance, science, negotiation. It just doesn't exist anywhere in the world where all of these different disciplines have to talk to each other, work with each other, and they love their jobs. And I think I'm exactly the same.
Good people.
Good people, yeah.
On the heels of that, to do good work, you have to enjoy the process, the day-to-day of showing up to the office and your literal job. What process do you enjoy the most running Topaz? Good deals?
I think for what I'm most proud of is the success. I think when you see a business go from $800 million to $4 billion market cap and you see the fruits of your labor win and succeed, and then you get to see the staff around you get to smile about it and be proud of it and say that they work at a company that is succeeding. And that's part of the culture talk I had earlier where, we're trying to build entrepreneurs here. And I'm going to use another reference of somebody's dad, unfortunately, here, but I remember the Borglins. You've had Craig Borglin on the show, but his father, Hugh Borglin, had said to his sons, Brett and Craig, were both in the oil business, is don't just be a landman, don't just be a geologist, don't just be an engineer, be an oilman. Understand every part of the business. And we just got out of our weekly ops meeting, and our geologist sits there and talks about different techniques for completions, and it's a fun place to be in. I think over time you can talk to different disciplines. They probably don't always see exposure to that, and we talk about it weekly and sit down, and it's nice. We can be armchair quarterbacks right now too as a royalty business. We don't have to actually go out and take the risk on drilling or completing the well, but we get to be proud of everything they do right. You get to be proud of your operators doing great things, and yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting business, that's for sure.
As the CEO of Topaz, you're not paid to literally drill the wells or draft the contracts or balance the books. Your job is to make decisions. What decisions do you focus on, and what's important to you at Topaz? What's the highest signal?
Number one, always think about the group, the staff. Are they overworked, underworked? Are they performing to their full ability? Are we asking too much for them? It always starts there. And I would say part two of that is what the investors need out of Topaz to make them want to invest. And so we're always kind of maneuvering and changing our slide deck or our message. Spent a lot of time evaluating. I talked about that before. We look at about $2 billion in opportunities per year, and I don't see that slowing down, and got to understand how that translates into our business. Is this a good piece of business to do? Is this the right piece of business to do? Is this going to make sense from a long-term perspective, or is this just a short-term win? I think that's something we focus on, and making decisions on, hey, do we proceed with this? Do we go after this idea? And a lot of our ideas are internally generated. It's not like we just sit back and wait for a producer or a midstream company to come to us. We're always pitching ideas. It's kind of like the chalkboard's out and let's drop another play and let's figure out how we're going to attack this angle or go after this opportunity, or sometimes convince a producer that it is a great opportunity to partner with Topaz, which we always think it is, but we're biased.
Good investing a lot of times is about not losing money. Instead of chasing returns, the idea is to preserve capital. So how do you balance new opportunities and speculative bets with preserving the returns at Topaz? How do you balance those two things?
Yeah, good question. So we did a fairly large deal in 2022 when we purchased the royalty on Delta Stream. It was one of the largest deals we've done up until now. We just did another big deal a couple weeks ago with Tourmaline, $278 million. Did a $100 million transaction with Whitecap in June. So we've spent kind of close to $400 million, which would have been our biggest year since the formative deal. In 2022, we took a pause and said, look, at oil prices high, let's ride some of this upside and this win, and let's replenish the balance sheet. And we did that. We paid over $100 million back in debt, let it kind of build up again. And I think great royalty companies, Franco-Nevada is one of the best at it. During weaker commodity cycles is when they want to buy. So be very counter-cyclical in your acquisition approach. And when you're making a lot of money, gather it. Take that cash and don't be in a big hurry to just run out and increase the dividend. We've done small sustainable dividend increases alongside our growth, not because we have cash in the system. And so I think timing from a royalty standpoint is extremely important. You have to know when the right time to be acquisitive and the right time to be patient. And I think we've done a good job of that. And I talked about messages to investors. We're very transparent in what we message. And I think lots of people could say they're going to do those things, but you gotta prove you're going to do those things.
The importance of saying no to bad business. Got to say no a lot.
I think I referenced Drew Tumback before, but one of the quotes he used to say, sometimes it's more fun to kill a deal than do a deal. And you have to have that discipline that you don't feel like you have to do a deal.
Couple of questions from Twitter/X. Is that all right?
Yeah, for sure.
USA stock listing. Is Topaz considering it, or are you focused on Canada?
Focus on Canada. We're not looking to expand in the US at this time from a royalty standpoint, an infrastructure standpoint, or a trading standpoint.
How much does Topaz plan to give back to dividend holders approximately in 2025?
Without any dividend increases, it'll be $201 million next year. And so we'll be, like I mentioned before, pretty close to $1 billion since inception of the company. We're now paying $1.32 per share. We started out at 80 cents per share. When we started the company, it was a 90% payout ratio. We sit around a 70% payout ratio with compressed gas prices right now. And so I do anticipate we'll do 1 to 2 dividend increases into 2025, but that is what we're messaging. But it's going to have the caveat that we've got to see growth inside the business. And like I said, that's what we've typically done. We've looked to do 1 to 2 dividend increases per year, and we look at our dividend every quarter with our board. We did have some growth with the acquisition, but we want that to settle and see what type of growth we see inside the business. And so we'll be very deliberate and patient with how we manage dividend increases.
How much does Topaz give back to the Canadian and the Alberta economy, to give perspective?
We employ 13 people, so those 13 people all have spending habits from what I've heard today in one of the meetings, but we try to give back charitable donations when we can. We just partnered with the Alberta Kids Cancer Care and are sponsoring a lodge out there, so we're pretty proud of that. I mentioned the $200 million in dividends per year. I think a lot of those are Alberta residents that hold some of that, but we don't have operators in the field like some of these big producers do. When I think about the Suncors, the Cenovus, the Tourmalines, the Arcs of the world, and the amount of people they are able to employ, it's a pretty powerful business.
Topaz staff is relatively small, but going forward, how do you make sure that it remains a entrepreneurial culture and not bureaucratic? Do you think about that? You kind of mentioned it already, but do you have to think about that daily?
I think we talk about this to investors. We think we could double the size of the company and it would only take another couple people. I think when I was on BNN, Andrew Bell made a comment about, hey, you guys almost run like a tech company. And we do. I mean, we don't have operators in the field. We take non-op positions in infrastructure. It's a royalty business, so our biggest task is compliance, make sure everybody's paying their bills right, and then collection. And so we're making sure everybody's paying right. And so, yeah, I think this could be a double with a couple more people. And I think that keeps the culture the way it is. And that's the beauty of this business is we've got a very small business and it's a to Z type business where I might be doing the dishes, and the next day I might be taking boxes downstairs. But every single person is like that in the organization. They're all A to Z and willing to chip in wherever's needed. And a lot of times without even being asked. It's just the culture of the Topaz way.
Was it important for you to put your own money in the company to create symmetry of risk with investors?
Yeah. If you don't believe in the business and show that through investment, then you shouldn't be running a business. I think, back to any good business should have owners in it, and owners should, if you want to be in that business as an owner, that's how you're going to win the most at the end of the day too. And so, yeah, I'm a big believer, and, I come by it honestly. I think you've seen some of my board members, they all have big ownership positions, not just in Topaz, but in their own companies as well.
How important has Mike Rose been to your career and the development of Topaz in general?
I mean, just the way he thinks about giving back to society. But you know what the most important thing is how he translates that to the rest of the group that's around him. And he never really gets that mad at you. He's just somebody you don't want to let down. You just feel bad about it all the time. And it's not just Mike though, like it's the entire leadership team at Tourmaline. It's the entire staff at Tourmaline. I got to work pretty close with a lot of folks at Tourmaline, and they became family. We used to do family camping trips together, go on ski vacations together, snowmobiles. Like we had a really good time. It was fun to go to work every day. It's just that want to win attitude. And a lot of companies in town have that. I'm just not going to focus on Tourmaline. I know a bunch of the ARC folks, the CNQ folks. It's just an industry of Alberta that just likes winning, and they have fun. They like going to their job. It's not, I think Charlie Locke was on and he talked about feels like he's never had to work a day in his life. And I feel like I'm still working. Don't worry about that. But it is a fun business and really enjoy it.
Looking ahead to the end of the quarter in 2025, what message would you leave for investors out there that are listening to this podcast?
I think Topaz is a fantastic place for investors to invest. It's very inflation proof. And I think if we saw anything, we're recording this the day after the US election. They're calling for some inflationary hikes with Trump being in, potentially some issues around tariffs. I think the resource sector will be okay, but I think Topaz is something that you can rely on. It's one of our good friends at Topaz said it's a business you get paid to wait. And so as we see multiple expansion inside the stock price, or we're at time from time, it will go down, but the dividend is sustainable. And so I think when you can get into a business like this, see and be exposed to a lot of different plays, Northeast BC, Peace River High, Deep Basin, Clearwater, Southeast Saskatchewan, for the generalist that wants to invest in a story, I think Topaz is the best place for them to invest. And along the way, like I said, you get paid to wait, a great dividend policy in place beside it. I think Topaz has lots of growth inside of it right now. We're tied to Northeast BC. We're 25% of the drilling activity inside Northeast BC via Tourmaline right now. That is volume that's going to feed LNG in some capacity go forward. That's 2 BCF, hopefully going to 5.5. Maybe next time we talk, 2030. Just kidding. You got to go to 500 episodes before we chat again.
Part 2.
But lots of great things coming from Topaz. Are we going to be as acquisitive as we have been? I can't tell you the answer to that because it's going to depend on the need for capital from different producers. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to be quiet from time to time and be acquisitive when we need to. And I'm excited about the future for Topaz.
Also, one of the ending questions of this podcast that we usually do is, what are you reading right now? What are you interested in?
Well, I'm not going to say I'm reading anything, but it's what I've read. And if you love the energy business, there's a book that Gray and Masters wrote called The Hunters, and it was based on the Canadian hunter story. It's tough to find. It's a 135-page book that they put together, and it talks about them coining the term Deep Basin and being the original.
Jim Gray.
Yeah, correct. I think it's just such an interesting book about, I think one of the engineers actually at Tourmaline worked on the original Elmworth well that they talk about in the book. So it's a fantastic book, and I recommend if you can get your hands on it. I had the book and I'd lend it to you, but I lent it to somebody and they never gave it back. So if they're listening to the podcast and you have my book, I'd like my book, The Hunters, back.
There you go. Good reading recommendation for anyone that is listening, along with the outlook for Topaz. So I think that's it. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, but if not, we can.
No, that's great, Trevor. And once again, congrats on 200 episodes. That's a big milestone, I know, in the media world. And so great job, and keep it up. I think people like your content. I think you've really done a great job of highlighting some of the great things about energy, oil and gas, entrepreneurship, because I know it's not just oil and gas people you have on, politics. Like you're covering all the topics, so keep it up.
Thank you. And as one of the biggest supporters, I got to say thanks to you too. So appreciate it.
You bet.
We'll end it there. Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. You can also subscribe to the podcast where your token of support is much appreciated. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.